Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. I wanted to take a moment before we start to say thank you for all the support and positive feedback on the podcast. One recent comment from @YoveerGill stood out, which highlighted finding a mentor in Enter the Boardroom. If anyone listening is interested in finding a traditional in-person mentor, do consider joining the Nurole board community, which you can find at community.nurole.com. For just £29 a month, we have created a space where you can get matched with a mentor, as well as learn, grow your board network, and tap into the hive mind of over 60,000 board members in real time. Today's guest, Andrew Tyler, is chair of Ainscough Crane Hire, the UK's largest mobile crane service provider, Winoa Group, a metal abrasive specialist, Detertech, provider of intelligence-led security solutions, ETL Systems, manufacturer of satellite RF systems, Joloda, Hydraroll, intralogistic loading systems manufacturer, senior advisor at Blackstone Credit, and founding partner at Ancient Horse Limited, a board consultancy and advisory services business. He was formerly chair of Kite Power Solutions and Sealand Support Services, NED at DataSite, and president of the Institute of Marine Engineering, Science and Technology. He has taken on all these positions within the last 6 years, having left his last CEO in 2019. Andrew, a huge welcome and thanks so much for joining us today.
It's an absolute pleasure, Ollie.
Andrew, you've clearly had an amazing journey and successfully managed to transition from CEO to chair, which is a path that I think will be of interest to many of our listeners. Can you just tell me a little bit about that transition, what inspired you and how you went about preparing for it?
I think the inspiration probably came from my long-time career mentor, Paul Lester, who's been a chairman for, must be the thick end of 15 years now. He has the misfortune of having had me twice as his CEO. And Paul always said to me that the best job in business was the non-executive chairman. And he is an outstanding chairman. So I was always very inspired and used to joke to him that my ambition was to be a mini Paul Lester when I grew up. So it was always there in my head that that's how I wanted the final chapter of my career. But then a bit of luck and timing, I finished my last executive role in December 2019. And I think actually another one of your podcast interviewees had also found herself finishing her exec career at the end. So maybe it was a vintage moment, but we were all then catapulted into COVID. And I was relatively young, early 50s, and thought one big CEO role to go, a good 5 years of a chunky CEO role will suit me very nicely, and then I'll set up for my non-exec career. But obviously during COVID, the whole recruitment market went very flat for a few months, understandably. And just before we all got locked down, I got an approach through a colleague of a colleague to come and just do a bit of advisory work on Ainscough Crane Hire, which was having a tough time of it. It had just been taken over by its bank, which was Blackstone Credit, and they just wanted to get an idea from somebody who sort of understood the construction, infrastructure and the rental sector as to why things might have gone wrong. So I went in as an advisor in the first instance, but quite quickly I got asked by Blackstone Credit whether I would consider a more substantial role with them, because they had some other, in this case, distressed assets that they were very interested in having somebody like me come in and then potentially chair. And I resisted it for a while. And then as these funny things happen, I was on a dog walk one day with my wife, who kept on, she was curious about this one. She kept coming back to it saying, why is this one so interesting? It's really interesting. You should look at this one. And eventually I thought, well, actually, if this is where I want to end up, then why wait 5 years? Why not grasp it now?
That's certainly a pattern I've seen repeating, where people who do that advisory work, and often it'll be unpaid, they're just doing it to help out of interest, and then often that turns into something more. The other pattern that I've spotted that you've referenced there is the role of the mentor, and that people who are most successful with building their portfolio careers often seem to have a mentor. We've recently launched, as part of our community, a Find a Mentor service that we're experimenting with, because we can see the power of it. But I'm really interested to hear how your understanding of that relationship?
I am a huge fan of mentorship, if that's the right term. Again, I got very lucky at the beginning with an individual called Sir John Park, who at the time was both the chairman of National Grid and the chairman of Anglo American, so two FTSE 100 companies. And he had a very strong maritime background, and at the time I was operating a lot in the maritime world. And fate threw us together. And I don't even know to this day quite why, but he clearly took a shine to me. And he adopted me without me asking. But if I'd had my time again, I definitely would have asked. And it was a very light touch mentorship. I would basically pop in to see him only every 6 months. Tried not to bother him too much because he was the chairman of two FTSE 100 companies, so he didn't need me turning up in his office too often. And he was always incredibly thoughtful. And in a half-hour meeting, I would come out absolutely buzzing with some of the advice and guidance that he'd given me. And if I then had a particular career situation, I would text him or email him saying, "Hey, John, is there any chance you could just have 10 minutes because such and such has come up, and I really would just love to get your view on it." So he was amazing. Now, Sir John is more or less retired now, but some years ago, he informally gave the baton to Paul Lester, who, as I said, was my career mentor, then followed by taking me on again as a CEO for one of the companies he chaired, and then subsequently has continued as a very, very close friend and mentor. And in my very early days in the chair role, he would be the person I would ring up with queries that were everything from how should I handle this situation to how does this aspect of remuneration work? For example, in the private markets, the way that the compensation operates with a fee-based aspect to it, but then this sort of all-important management incentive plan. And Paul would give me advice on, well, this is how this is supposed to work, and these are the sort of expectations you should, and so on. So he was just extraordinarily useful.
You, like a lot of people who've been very successful, attribute a large part of it to luck. But I'm always skeptical when I hear that. You were taking the proactive steps in calling those mentors every 6 months yourself. I could imagine some people listening to this thinking, I would never dare call someone like that. They just haven't got time for me. But was it you that took that proactive step? And were there other things that you can think of on reflection that actually you do that catalyze that relationship?
I suppose there's a little bit of my character there, but I will say great leaders, they recognize helping others in their careers to walk in their footsteps is something that's, first of all, extremely important, but secondly, their way of very genuinely giving back to a great business career that they themselves have had. And I would be very surprised if you find many great leaders in business who will not point to a small handful of individuals who sometimes, for no obvious reason, have been there for them. So yes, you've got to be respectful, and you don't want to go around to sort of making a nuisance of yourself. But I think that most of us can probably think of people who we've got huge respect for, who are more senior and experienced to us, and who we would love to have a little bit of personal help and support from. And as I said, I think in a lot of cases, a quiet word, respectfully put, and you'd be very surprised at how many people would say, yes, do you know what, I will absolutely be prepared to help you. To your opening point, I think it was Gary Player who said, the more I practice, the luckier I get. I think network is one of the really, really crucial things when you are looking in particular to build a portfolio career, a non-executive career. And I've always loved networking. I love people. I love being with people. I like meeting new people. So I guess I naturally gravitate towards networking. I was also very wisely told by Leo Quinn, the current CEO at Balfour Beatty, who again was somebody else, I should say, who helped me a lot at key points in my career, including helped me rewrite my CV once. And Leo once said to me, he said, look, you have to kiss a lot of frogs. And what he meant by that is when you're looking for new roles, looking to develop your career, you'll meet 20 people and one of them will turn out to be extraordinarily useful to you, probably about 3 years later, but you have absolutely no idea which of those 20 it might be. And this is the advice I always give to people when they are looking to, particularly if they've reached a point of inflection in their career and they're looking to go into an unknown space for them, is just go and meet an awful lot of people, drink an awful lot of coffee, 10 minutes with somebody. Most people will be good enough to give you 10 minutes. And actually 10 minutes is often all it takes. So just go and spend time. And I have been almost military about the way I've gone about planning this in the past. I would book 3 days in London in my diary, and I would spend the preceding 3 weeks booking appointments and literally stacking my day with meetings and calls, and I would hit it very, very hard. And I might come back after 3 days having seen 30 people and probably generated another 30 leads at the same time. And now I look back on it, I think, well, that has now paid off in so many different ways. And sometimes it's building those close relationships with organizations like Nurole, where, let's face it, you want to be front of mind when the opportunity that suits you comes along. But we're all very, very busy. We all meet dozens and dozens and dozens of people. So how can you be the person who comes front of mind, whether it's in an executive search firm or whether it's a private equity company or whether it's just an individual who happens to also be very well connected and has got their ear to the ground, bearing in mind that firms like yours will sometimes come to me and say, this role's come up. Have you got any ideas of somebody who might be suitable? And I want to have people in the front of my mind that I can recommend and say, well, you should have a conversation with them. And, all you need sometimes is a 3-minute conversation for that individual to say, do you know what? I think you'd have a really interesting conversation with so-and-so, and I'll make the connection for you. It's all it takes sometimes.
It's very powerful. The idea that you're structuring it to that degree and being that considered about building that network, I think is a really key insight. And it's one of the things actually, again, that we've been testing in the community is how to make that networking less painful for people. And we've been trying these speed dating options for people where they just get through some structured conversation, 10 minutes with 6 different board members. And it's been quite interesting to see how that's played out and leads to these completely serendipitous further connections. But what we're hoping is if those meetings you're talking about, you have a hit rate of 1 in 20, if we can move that to 2 in 20 or 3 in 20, then that would have been a massive value add for people. When you got recommended as a guest for the podcast, one of the things that really stood out about you was that you have undertaken at your own instigation a self-review as a chair. I'm really interested to understand what prompted you to do that.
I'm sure, like just about anybody in a C-suite today, you have been a participant in some form of individual and or team reflection. 360 reviews have been a feature of business life for a very long time. I have always been a big enthusiast of the team review, where you look at individuals' profiles, but you look at them together as a team, and you use that as a way of understanding each other better so that you can work better together as a team. And I feel that when I became a chairperson, first of all, being the CEO is a lonely job, then try the non-exec chair, because that's even less supportive, because you are not there in and around your C-suite colleagues, supporting each other, sharing each other's problems day in, day out. So there was an element of this which was, how am I doing? I mean, I don't really know. I'm doing my best, but I don't really know. I think the other thing is that I have also seen situations, luckily I've not ever had a chairman like this myself, but I've seen situations where a chairperson clearly believes they've now arrived at the perfect, fully formed role. This is the pinnacle of business, as it were, being the chair of the board, and therefore thou can do no wrong. And that intuitively has to be rubbish. Any bit of even basic self-reflection would tell you that you kind of never, ever stop learning. And I think when you move into a very different role, how can you be instantly brilliant at that on day one? You've never done it before. And then I thought, well, okay, so how do you go about finding out? Well, you can go out for a nice dinner with your shareholder or go and have a natter with your CEO. But I feel that's never a great way to get objective feedback. And that's why people use 360s and those kind of psychometric assessments and so on in order to get a more objective idea on how they're performing. So I've been working with a fantastic lady called Sarah Kilgour, who was working on some other communications related work in one of my businesses. And I just really liked the way she thought about leadership. And so we just chatted around this idea. I said, look, Sarah, I'm kind of feeling that I need to find some way of getting objective feedback on how I'm doing, because I'm only 3.5 years into this. I want this to be my career for the next 10 years, and I want to be the best. that I can possibly be. And therefore, I'd like to understand 3.5 years in, it seems like an appropriate length of time of me doing the job. I've also obviously got the huge benefit or privilege of doing it for more than one company. So I've got different stakeholders from different companies, both executive and shareholders. And so Sarah said, I'd love to do this. And so we looked around to see if we could find a kind of off-the-shelf framework for this. And basically, we didn't find one. And maybe there is one out there, and we didn't find it. So Sarah went back to first principles of this. And she said, well, look, let's start with what does a great chairperson in the private market look like from the perspective of the people who care about it. And so she did a round of interviews, she did a load of research, she spoke to a number of search firms and so on and said, what are the stakeholders looking for in a great chair? And she condensed that into a set of attributes. And then from that, she then derived a survey. And so I then provided her with 20 odd stakeholders, shareholders, executive, my CEOs, CFOs, etc., from my community across my different companies. They then all sort of did the survey, and then that was followed up with a structured interview to get under the skin and get some verbatim comments and anecdotes and so on. And then she put that all together into a very well-structured report. We sat down, went through it all, areas which didn't necessarily instantly connect with me. We talked through why individuals might have had a certain view on things. And then at the end of it, there was a quantitative element to it because there were questions that were structured, and therefore she was able to do some level of quantitative analysis. And then the rest of it was through the conversations that she'd had with these various stakeholders. And of course, the most critical thing was then identifying areas for improvement, things that I could focus on to get better. So that was the basic process. It took about 3 months from end to end.
What insights have you had from your self-review that have influenced the way you chair?
That balance between, if you imagine around the board table, expressing your opinion as the chair, as opposed to facilitating the expression of others' opinions. I am opinionated. I do have an opinion. And at times I could play my opinion in later in the discussion and maybe more softly in the discussion. I guess as the chairperson, you're the head of the board. So you're naturally where there's going to be a level of deferment to you. And I think making sure your opinion doesn't get overweighted in the discussion. And in fact, I think it's probably fair to say I have not got this. I'm not doing this as well as I could and should do, which is the reason I'm raising it. I think sometimes your opinion as a chair matters in the context of reaching consensus and resolution more than it does as a singular expression of view, if that makes sense. So your job as a chairperson should be to gather the opinions from around the table, see how from those opinions you can work towards a consensus, but perhaps at times, some of your opinions are important in forming that final outcome and resolution from the discussion. I suppose the only other time when a chairperson's opinion perhaps can be a slightly louder voice is where maybe there's an area of particular specialization where you as the chair just might, by coincidence, happen to really be the most experienced and specialist voice around the table on a particular issue. And then probably your opinion would carry more weight, it could be more overt. So I think that's something when you come out of an exec role into a non-exec role, I would say as a general point of view that you are likely to have to dial back the deployment of your opinions than maybe when you were in an executive role.
Now, there are two other topics that I really want to get into before we go on to our lightning round. The first that really jumped out at me was the complexity of some of the shareholder environments that you've worked in. And if I think back to my time as a private equity investor, there were a couple of horror shows I had where we were invested alongside some as well as other investors, and it was complex. But when I compare it to some of the stakeholder environments you've navigated with not just investors and strategics, but also government or quasi-government entities, I'm fascinated to hear how you think about navigating and balancing the interests of those sorts of complex shareholder dynamics as a chair.
I have been super lucky. I mean, at the time it didn't feel like it, but I've been super lucky, as you've said, to be in some really fantastically complex shareholder situations. And funny enough, it's not necessarily related to the size or type of the organization. My first CEO role with, dare I say it, Paul Lester as my chair, was actually for a sort of fairly small late stage tech company that had, as sort of tech companies in their early stages often do, had an awful lot of different investors come in at different times in different rounds with really very different motivations for being involved. And you couldn't have dreamt up a set of shareholders with more diverse reasons for having been involved in the company, or for that matter, financial outlooks. So that was a bit of a baptism of fire. But I was sort of too green at the time to realise how complex that was that I was getting into here. And I suppose I operated largely by instinct. And my instinct was get to know everybody as well as you possibly can at both a personal level, but also the context within which they've got involved in this particular business. So forget the specifics of the circumstances. Just immerse yourself in who is this individual? What are they all about? What are they like as a person? Why are they in this? What is an outcome that's going to put a smile on their face? Not that you can guarantee the latter, but then when the fireworks start and it all gets really tricky, you've got quite a deep sense of, right, that's really going to annoy Jim, and that's going to have Margaret doing backflips, and that's really going to have Mike and Joe at each other's throats.
Is there an example you could bring it to life with?
It's always tricky in these situations, isn't it? Because you need to be rather careful of the libel laws when you start getting too specific. But the one I was alluding to was one where we had two very well-known individuals who were individual shareholders in the business, both of whom were forces of nature, who'd actually been very canny about when they'd come in to the business. We had got a trail of ex-founders and CEOs and other individuals who had been involved during the 10 years or so that this business had been around. And then we got some more structured investors, green fund type investors who had come in and gone through the normal route of putting it through an IC. And then we had got three very large household name industrials. I mean, I can give you a couple of the names. If you've got Shell on the one hand and the now late Max Mosley on the other hand as material shareholders in your business, the chances of you being 100% aligned on outcomes is approximately zero. And the chances of you being aligned in your approach to things is also approximately zero. But I just spent the time trying to understand everyone's positions and why it matters to them. And from that, you can start to think about, okay, at the end of the day, everyone's going to have to compromise here. That goes without saying. So where am I going to start finding some middle ground here? Whereas is often famously put, everyone goes away equally annoyed with the outcome. And that would certainly have been the case in this particular instance. And I think that as a template, that was a super complex situation, even though the business itself was quite small. But I think that fundamental approach is how I take the approach to everything I'm doing now. I mean, most of my companies that I'm involved in have got multiple stakeholders who desire different outcomes. And they include, by the way, the executive, who in the private markets are obviously also share in the business. I take that same approach always. You should just spend as much time as you can with people, including, really crucially, the ones who aren't necessarily the noisy ones, because there's quite often individuals who just happen to be more forthright, but they aren't necessarily the ones with the biggest stake. So ensuring the ones who are being quiet, who might very well have a bigger stake, you are proactively going to speak to them, understanding what they're trying to get out of this situation. I think that's really, really critical. And also, I think making everybody collectively part of what you're trying to do, so that you don't have people standing outside the ring throwing things, that everybody has a sense that their participation is required to get the outcome that you're trying to get. So they can't just be, as I said, standing passively on the sidelines. Even if they're not a board member, it doesn't stop them being bought into what you're trying to do and the outcomes that you're collectively trying to get out of this. And at the very worst, they'll end up with more understanding, so that if they do have to compromise, at least they're compromising from a position of kind of understanding the dynamics understanding the issues that you're dealing with, and maybe, bluntly put, having a little bit more sympathy with you than they might otherwise, because they'll appreciate that you're actually trying to thread a really difficult needle.
Practically speaking, do you do as a chair to achieve that outcome? The sort of thing I might do would be to go and talk to each individual shareholder and say, look, this is the dilemma I'm facing. I'm trying to balance X, Y, and Z. Have you got any thoughts on how to do that? So you're sort of inviting them to see the problem from your perspective and solve it with you.
Spot on, Ollie. That's exactly what I do. I just feel like you can't talk too much, really, can you? My article of faith here is that if you are being an honest and upfront with people, they will 999 times out of 1,000 respond positively to that. And do it early. Do it before it needs to happen, not when you're having to react to a situation. Certainly the getting to know people. Do that bit, and why are they in this, and what do they want out of it? Do that long before that's become a rarefied issue. For example, don't wait till you're in the planning stages of an exit process. Do that at the beginning when you're first involved. I feel like almost your best time to do it is when you don't really know each other, and you can come in and ask all the stupid questions and be really almost disarmingly open in your questioning with individuals.
What have you learned about managing private equity investors as a stakeholder and as a chair that a smart chair or C-level who hasn't worked with private equity wouldn't necessarily find obvious?
At the soft factors level, I'll say there's no difference, because at one level there isn't. It's going back to all the things I just said. They are stakeholders in the business. What are their interests? What are the outcomes they're trying to get out of this? I think if you're new into PE, what is critical is that you understand how PE, in the same way that if I was to go into a PLC, I need to understand how the public markets work, because that's the backcloth, that's the backdrop to the way individuals behave. So through a lot of conversations over the years, but also a lot of reading, a lot of research, I've spent a lot of time trying to understand how the history of private equity, how private equity works, very particular things like the way that their fund dynamic operates. How do these funds get initiated? How do they get invested in? How are the assets originated? What are the pressures that they get from their limited partners? Because at the end of the day, they've got their own external stakeholders, the limited partners. And how does that influence their behaviors? How does the dynamics of the way that one fund might be maturing versus a fund that's a new fund that they're trying to get invested in? Because I've very often found that the way that their particular perspective on an asset may have a lot to do with, well, this is the state of the fund. This is either the financial performance of the fund, or we're trying to attract our new fund, so we kind of need some goals scored in the existing fund, or the way the other assets in the fund are performing versus this asset. We're really looking maybe to hold this asset a year or so longer, or a year or so less. I mean, really understanding, and also, bluntly put, think about the incentives at a personal level of the individuals that you're dealing with within PE, because their compensation structure is not the same as a compensation structure that you'd find in the public markets. It's not the same as the compensation structure you'd find in executives. So given that an element of us being in business is to make money out of this, and there's no shame in that, understanding how PE makes its money is really important as well, because that will condition their view on the asset and what the outcomes are that they need to get from the asset. It really is very different from public markets or something that's owned by a pension scheme or a family office or whatever. The private equity business operates on this deal cycle model. That's what private equity do. They buy assets, they create value, they sell the asset. And the difference is how they make their money. I should also add, and I will just put in a little plug for this as well, at the same time as you're understanding how private equity works, understand how private debt works, because private debt is becoming a very big asset class now. I've had the huge fortune of, as I said at the very beginning of our conversation, of sort of coming in as a senior advisor to Blackstone Credit. Now, okay, I'm working on distressed assets that effectively have undergone a debt to equity swap. So you can argue that they are private equity now, but they're sitting in credit funds. And so I've spent an equal amount of time learning how the credit side of the business operates. And they have a completely different perspective on things, because they are basically lending money at a fixed return, and they're trying to manage their downside risk rather than taking risk to achieve outsized growth to get a greater return. So I think just the more you can do to educate yourself, the more you're going to find it easier to understand the motivations and the dynamics that are going on around the board table.
I can think of a few different situations where either the way the carry was structured or the way the return hurdles were structured or the way where someone was in their promotion life cycle, whether it was to becoming partner or a managing partner, was suddenly driving these extraordinary decisions. So you could see everyone else couldn't figure out what was going on because they hadn't understood that, why they weren't prepared to sign off on what on the outside seemed like a perfectly reasonable ask, but they hadn't understood those sort of underlying dynamics.
They're very, very relatable. And I think one of the things that I often will spend a lot of time talking to my execs about, my CEO about, my CFO is, I'll say, let's just look at it through the eyes of our private equity sponsors. This is what's going on over there. So this is the pressure they're coming under, maybe from their managing partner or from their LPs. They own us. They own this business. So it's incumbent on us to understand the pressures that they're operating under as well. And that if we're not doing X or Y, this is the consequence to them. It's not just the folks sitting around your board admiring the wreckage of your budget. This has got consequences for them as well.
Andrew, the time has flown by, which means it's time to go on to the lightning round, where I'm going to say a short statement and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
I can manage that.
So first up, the boardroom behaviour that irritates you most.
When board members, and it can be any board members, and including the executive, descend into executive tactical detail that really is the business of their executive ops board and not the company board.
The best book every board member should read, and why?
This sounds very Desert Island Discs when they ask for 17 luxuries instead of one, but it's not actually a book as such, so I hope that's okay. But I do think every board member should read and possibly have posted on their office wall Percy Shelley's sonnet Ozymandias. I think in business, as in life, arrogance and hubris always ends up in ruin.
Your favourite quote and why?
I'm choosing this one because probably over the long term, this is the one that I've come back to heaven knows how often, is why not Niebuhr's God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, particularly the third piece.
Your most significant professional insight?
I think it's that humans naturally prefer myth and legend to facts and data.
Your worst professional advice that you've ever received?
I've received this on more than one occasion, which is a view that chairpersons need sector-specific experience. And as time has gone on, I feel very strongly it's the opposite that's required.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
That's a very good question. I think probably that great boards are actually in and of themselves great teams.
What's something people commonly misunderstand about you?
I would say that my cuddly sheep's clothing is commonly misunderstood for my inner wolf.
And last but not least, 3 things that those listening should take away from this if they take nothing else.
I would say first is that you shouldn't consider taking on non-executive roles unless you love supporting others in achieving their success. It's definitely not all about you. Second, I think it's being very focused on the specific contribution you make to value creation for the business that you're involved in at a personal level. And the third is that you are definitely never too old or too experienced to learn.
Wow, Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to share a little bit of insight into the amazing way that you approach your boards with a sort of phenomenal growth mindset. I've taken lots and lots from this. So really, thank you so much for taking the time to share it with us.
Well, thanks very much, Ollie. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And thanks to all of you listening. We've been blown away by the incredible feedback about how this podcast has been helping you get board roles and become better board members. This podcast is for you, so if you'd like to suggest guests, topics, difficult challenges, or you'd like to share stories about how the podcast has impacted you, or have suggestions on how we can improve, please email podcast@nurole.com. That's podcast@nurole.com, and let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, thanks again for listening, and look forward to having you back here for the next discussion.